Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And today, we're going to have another episode with people smarter than me on the show. I have basically 2 college professors that have written books and have certain expertise on things. And so we're going to have them come on and discuss those topics. And I think this is going to be a really, really enlightening show and a very relevant show to things that are happening in the world today. So I thank y'all for joining the show, and thank you for listening. And we're ready to kick things off. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. An Illinois sheriff announced his retirement following the firing and arrest of his deputy for the fatal shooting of Sonia Massey. A grand jury indicted an Ohio police officer on 4 counts of murder for the fatal shooting of a 21-year-old pregnant black woman, Takia King, in a grocery store parking lot. Manu Shafiq resigned as Columbia University president amidst criticism of her handling of campus protests pertaining to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Representative Ilhan Omar secured the Democratic Party nomination for a 4th term in Minnesota's 5th District Democratic primary. Vice President Harris leads Donald Trump 42 to 37% in the race for the November 5th U.S. presidential election, according to a recent Ipsos poll. Both candidates will debate on September 10th on ABC. Donald Trump's presidential campaign reported that its internal communications were hacked and blamed Iran. Hurricane Ernesto caused heavy rainfall and major outages on the island of Puerto Rico. Ukraine reported a significant advance into Russia's Kursk region, marking the largest foreign incursion into Russia since World War II. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced he would resign next month due to public dissatisfaction with political scandals and rising living costs. Brazilian civil defense teams recovered the remains of passengers from a plane crash near Sao Paulo, confirming 62 casualties. An Israeli airstrike on a Gaza school compound killed around 100 people, according to the Hamas-run Gaza government. Iran may refrain from directly retaliating against Iran for the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh if a ceasefire deal in Gaza is reached. And the Montana Supreme Court struck down a state law requiring parental consent for minors seeking an abortion. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now, it is time for my first guest, Dr. Crystal Chambers. Dr. Crystal Renee Chambers is the 2023 Barbara Townsend Distinguished Lecturer, Association for the Study of Higher Education, Council for the Advancement of Higher Education Programs, and Professor of Educational Leadership at East Carolina University, where she examines matters of race and gender equity in higher education, particularly the areas of college choice and faculty advancement. Dr. Chambers is the author/co-author of over 50 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and monographs, as well as the editor of 8 book and journal volumes, including most recently, Black Women's Pathways to Executive Academic Leadership, Lessons from Lived Experiences. Dr. Chambers is a 2018 Carnegie Fellow and is a co-PI on Thrive at ECU, an NSF Advanced Adaptation Grant, and has served as a coach and faculty expert with the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Crystal Chambers. All right, Dr. Crystal R. Chambers. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm doing good. I am in my season as you are, as classes are getting ready to start. So I know you're excited about all that, getting to see all those young, fresh faces coming in. I wanted to talk to you based off a book that you wrote. You wrote a book that came out in October under the label of my good friend, Dr. A.O. Sakai, and UWP, called Black Women's Pathways to Executive Academic Leadership. So what I want to do is just kind of talk about based on the book, some stuff, real stuff that's been going on, and pick your brain in dealing with that. But before we even get to that, my icebreaker is I give the guest a quote and then let them respond to it. So your quote is, "When and where I enter, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." What does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, so that quote is from Anna Julia Cooper 2 centuries ago. And yet I see it time over time. I happen to teach a history course where when Black women have come to the table, when they have, entered into academia, when they've entered into political spaces, that they have been able to be more inclusive in the way that populations are addressed. And you see this very much with, Kamala Harris coming in and saying, I want to be here to represent the people who are not at the table. And so it's not just, when and where I enter, all the Black folks come in with me. No, all y'all means all y'all get to come in with me, because my role here is to broaden the space, to advance a way of being that is inclusive, welcoming, accepting, affirming of all of us. Because we know when we think about, what it means to be in a just society, to actually have justice, when people are silenced, when they're needs aren't being met, then they raise up, they rile up. And we see this actually happening on the right, where you have a lot of disaffected individuals. And so they act out. And so how can I bring in everyone with me so that they feel that they are heard, that their concerns are being addressed, and we can work together collectively to advance our nation, to advance our students, to just advance.
So I do have a Kamala question for you, but I'm going to save that for later. When you were doing the research for the book, what did your research tell you about Black women pursuing leadership at PWIs as opposed to Black women pursuing leadership at HBCUs?
So one of the challenges across the board really is that Black women have more levels of education at the bottom of career and leadership trajectories. And it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about a PWI, an HBCU, the corporate sector, or even nonprofits. There's actually data confirming that we tend to be more educated, but then not necessarily entering into those leadership positions. And so even, at a PWI, you have Black women who are, questioned. There's a book entitled Presumed Incompetent. So you walk into the room and the assumption is that you don't know what you're talking about, even though you might be the most educated person in the crowd. I love Rosalind, I'm blanking on her last name, but she was the Rosalind Brewer, I believe. She was the CEO of Starbucks, and she tells a story about going into a conference of CEOs, a symposium, some type of talk. And this white man looks at her like, "Why are you here?" And after that, she proceeds to take her seat front and stage because she was the guest speaker. She was the keynote speaker at that time. And that's actually what a lot of women at PWIs experience, in that it is unexpected that you would be here in leadership. But then, you pull out the Vita because we have more of these I would say managerial experiences, usually a higher level of education. It's, oh yeah, she's got receipts. But then the conversation shifts into, well, who is she as an individual? And so we see this with the attack on Fannie Willis. She's a thug. She's this, she's that. And so you're going to attack my person because my Vita is absolutely impeccable. And that's the way that you come at me within a predominantly white context, in or outside of academia. And I'm switching back in between the two because academia is just a microcosm of society. And so, what we do on the outside in society, we see it in a fishbowl microscopic context on our campuses. In HBCUs, it seems to be less of that presumed incompetence, as much as from what I see, as we have a way of doing things around here, and we have given you a shot to take the helm, but we expect you to adapt, adjust to the way that we do things around here. And so this book is an edited volume, and so I do have to give a shout out to my 3 authors. All are doctoral students. Well, no longer doctoral students. They're graduates of mine, scholar practitioners in their own right. Katrina Arnold at Pitt Community College, who's the director of academic and developmental support there. Tamika Wardlow Williams, who's the VP of student formation and the Dean of Students at Belmont University, and Nicole Lewis at Elizabeth City State University. She's the Dean of Students there. And, as Dr. Lewis, really explores in this HBCU sector, just seeing how all of the unstated things and thinking about how other organizations within Black communities are organized, and the expectations of, I'll just say it, male dominance. And so just as your deacon board runs the church and will run a pastor out, they will run out assistant presidents. And we saw that with Christine McPhail very recently. So, and that was very much in short order with what happened with Geneva Gay at Harvard.
Right, and that was going to be my next question about Dr. Gay at Harvard University, and what was your take on that? But before you answer that, one of the things I noticed being in the political arena, that where I've had female colleagues, like, if they were younger, they were perceived to be interns when they first got to the legislature. And they were actually an elected official. And then the older women, if because most of these folks don't follow what's going on in the state, outside of maybe the governor or something, like, they don't pay attention to who's going to be serving with them, right? So if they saw an older black woman, the first thing they would think is, oh, so we got a new staff member, right? It automatically never was, oh, are you a new representative? Are you a new state senator? You know what I'm saying? It was always something beneath them. So I get it in the political sense, because there's no, in the provision in the Mississippi State Constitution, it says either you've read the Constitution or have it read to you. So academics is not necessarily a requirement to be a state legislator. But in the academic arena, it just is kind of bizarre that people that have PhDs and master's degrees and all that stuff look down on their contemporaries, especially based on gender, and especially black folks at HBCU. But you explained the culture fairly well. So let's get to Dr. Gay at Harvard.
Yeah, and my apologies. I misspoke. That was Claudine Gay, not Geneva Gay, and I respect Geneva Gay. She's an education researcher, and so I tend to speak her name a little bit more frequently than Dr. Claudine Gay. But you're absolutely right in terms of ageism. If you were to try to guess my age, where would you peg me?
I'm not going to do that. I have an educated guess because of your degrees and all that stuff. But yeah, just off the street, no, ma'am, you're not gonna get me in that trap. No, I've lived long enough.
Usually people usually peg a good 15 years plus. Even Black folks get it wrong, and so unless I'm sitting there with my Vita right next to me. And it does impact how they address me, how they regard me. I'm not one of the students on campus.
Well, it's like, I will say this much: Black don't crack, and we've proven that time and time again. Because when I tell people my age, they look at me like, "Really, really?" Even people my age, they're like, "What are you talking about?" So yeah, I get that, but yeah, with Dr. And I knew who you were talking about. It was just that, and I'm glad if Miss Geneva, when she hears the podcast, is like, no, we're not speaking anything ill for you. You're gonna be okay. But yeah, how did you feel? What was your visceral reaction? And then kind of like dissect it as far as like the dynamics that happened that led, because as we're recording this now, the president of Colombia, a South Asian woman, she just had to quit over the same stuff that was going on.
And and the attack was, multifaceted against multiple women who were leads. So you had the leader at Penn. She immediately, more reactively stepped down, and there because you had faculty in the Wharton School in particular who were outspoken and did not support her. With Dr. Gay, the attacks were were brutal, even more so. Here's a space where I might disagree with my colleagues a little bit, because I do study the higher education space, but Harvard was somewhat reluctant to let her go. The conversation went out. And so, no, they did not come out to her defense. This is our president, do or die, Harvard Corporation is Harvard Corporation. And so they have a reputation several centuries, a couple of centuries long. And so they have that to protect. They have donor bases to protect and the like. But it was like, we kind of like her and we'd like her to stay, was kind of the level of defense that they had against her. I tend to agree with my dear colleague, Lori Patton, when she says resigning was probably the best thing that Dr. Gay could have done. Because if we look at the two Black women who died suddenly in September of 2023, Black women presidents, there was the one at Temple University and another one, I want to say Mountain View College in Tennessee, community college, just unknown reasons. We have taken on John Henryism to the hilt, where, we are going to be successful or die trying. And quite frankly, Harvard University isn't worth dying over. Racial battle fatigue is real. There are real consequences, long-term consequences to your heart. There's increased cancer. There's just, host of things that can go on with your body. And she is young enough to have a vibrant career and impact thereafter. In some respects, to not be entangled with the seat of the president, it gives her more of a platform, more of a voice, because she's not constrained by Harvard Inc.
Yeah, and the Harvard situation, like you said, they were the closest. It was like, so here's my theory about, and this is political. You don't have to agree with it. But the common denominator in all three women being released or resigning was that Stefanik congresswoman from New York. So the Columbia is obvious because she represents, I think, that part of New York, right? Or close to it. But she's a New York congresswoman, and she's the highest ranking Republican, right? The Harvard issue, she's an alum. So naturally, she didn't want no Black woman representing her institution anyway. So this gave her an excuse, and using her faith, which she doesn't practice, but she uses her faith to, justify all three of these women. And then the Penn thing was like, well, Eric, okay, I get it on Columbia, I get it on Harvard. What's the Penn connection? That's where Donald Trump went to school. He went to Penn. So, I got to look good for my dear leader. So how it lined up, I can get rid of the chick at Harvard. I can get rid of the chick at Columbia. I can get rid of the chick at Penn, and Donald Trump will love me, right? So when you women go through all of this, it's amazing the microaggression of misogyny that women have to deal with. It's one thing to kind of deal with the Archie Bunker types head on, but to the microaggression piece, like I said, and to have a woman kind of instigating the pressure on these other women, that doesn't help. That's just like in the Black community, and we're seeing it now, where Black folks are trying to play the microaggression game on behalf of white folks, going after any Black person that's in a high profile, especially in a political sense. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that? And when I was saying what I was saying about using the word chick, I was speaking in the mindset of Stefanik. I'm not. But that's misogynistic too, right? Even using that kind of term. So just talk to me about that.
Well, I mean, we certainly have these cultural pieces that are, we are passed down. And so it is part of our vernacular. I'm not excusing it, but we all have our re-education that we need to do, e-racism, e-sexism, et cetera, that we need to, work on in ourselves. And so we're all on no judgment there. The only correction I would make is just to say, what was micro about the aggression? This was aggressive, to quote Bettina Love. And it was an aggression of a woman by other, on other women. And what we it's very much in that Mean Girls spirit, the Queen Bee spirit that, one's going to be on top and it's going to meet me. It's, we talk about in the African American community, crabs in a barrel, but this was very much a crab grab that I'm going to pull these women down. And it was such a missed opportunity because never before in our history in the US had there been that many women at the helm of Ivies, you know? And so rather than being the woman who supports other women, I'm going to distinguish myself by picking the other crabs off the top of the barrel. And yeah, it's to say unfortunate is an understatement. My hope would be like those women, those presidents would get together and recount their story. But there's nothing like sending your own to get after you, because then it allows others to say, see, look there, that you obviously don't have the credentials because you're not even accepted. But we know this, like, just for any time you have somebody that stands out, it's your own that are going to that can be the most damaging. We saw this with Kendi. To go back to be biblical about it, he came to his own and his own received him not. And those are the ones who actually took him out. So there's a pattern here, but it's unfortunate that we can't break that pattern.
Yeah, in the sense when I was saying micro, is that you're right. It was blatant as far as what the congresswoman was doing, but I was using micro in the sense of race because two of the three presidents were women of color, and so that's why I use it. She didn't come out and say, "I don't want these women of color over these Ivy League schools." She used the whole issue about free speech and all that stuff and anti-Semitism to justify her going after those women of color. But but I feel what you're saying. I do.
It's an interesting when wipe out racism. Yeah. you know?
Yeah.
I always find it really interesting, they start clutching pearls and it's like, really? Is that your everyday experience? Do you really think that she, and then there's the lawyering piece. I mean, I have a JD myself. And so, when you hear these presidents speaking or recounting in a lawyer speak, it doesn't play well. And so rather than seeing it for what it was, again, just missed opportunities all around. You're damned if you respond and you're damned if you don't. I believe, who was it? Lee Bowman and Jean Gallos talk about presidents in the 1960s, the ones who were ousted because they acted and the ones who were ousted because they didn't act. They were all in catch-22 positions. When it was seen that when you negotiated with the student, that was supposed to be wrong. But if you take your stance and you bring in police, then you're also wrong there. So I mean, these were really tough positions, and so rather than being empathetic and let's finding a solution, I'm going to distinguish myself by being the crab who knocks everyone else down.
And also, it's obvious that you have some kind of device where you were looking at my notes when I was putting together these questions, because you already referenced my next question, which was dealing with the two university presidents who died, and they were both sisters. The third one I was going to add was the lady, I think at Lincoln University, who committed suicide. And so the question I have to ask related to that is, being a black woman in those positions, that's stressful, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. But more importantly, if that is the case, then what can be done to alleviate that stress? Because the lady at Lincoln sounded like she was basically being mentally tortured. listening to people that worked in that administration and all that stuff. And I think the president just got a slap on the wrist or something. I don't even think
Yeah,
he
he got to come back.
yeah.
And I find it, the whole situation is horrific. To be perfectly honest, I thought that my sisters in student affairs were okay because there are more Black and brown people in student affairs than they are on the academic side. But in each of these cases, you're talking about being at the top. And we know when we get to the mountain, the air gets thinner, you're more isolated. And so you don't have the same support structures. And, there are people who are close to me who knew her very, very well. And so, it hurt. I mean, it hurt us deeply. I think the thing that we need to realize that even though, if I'm the head of student affairs, if I'm the head of academic affairs, my friends are not on campus, but I need to have a broader community that has my back. I need to be able to, if my literal mother and father aren't around, who are the mamas and babas in the larger community who can continue to lift me up? Where is it that I can go have fun? I mean, when you think about these jobs, these are not, 9 to 5 commitments. This is all day, every day, called in on Saturdays. Student affairs in particular, at 3 a.m., something goes downtown, you have to be there. So then how do you find that time to, detach? And so there's one thing just to be able to step back and be away from it, but then how are you being poured into? And so for some, that might be your faith, your spirituality, a good TED talk. Some might be, some, individual revival in the mountains. I'm a water person, so my quick jaunt to the beach. It's not to show off my bikini. It really is to just sit there and let the water wash over me, the sounds, all of that. And so remembering that, yeah, we're going to have to detach, we're going to have to renew, we're going to have to be poured back into, because you cannot pour out of an empty vessel. The other thing I would like to say very specifically about that situation, in law, we have something called the reasonable man standard. And so if the actions of women who are on the receiving end of misogyny are judged through the lens of what a man deems reasonable, we will never get equity. We will never get fairness. And so we need to think about what is reasonable from the point of view of the individual, even if we, aggregate it up to the group sense. I mean, I think, just, violence against women in general, we don't have a handle on it because men just don't see it as big enough of a deal. And I think this makes Harris's presidency just the more valuable to all women because of the assault on women just across our nation, and just allowed, whether it's online character assassinations, the scams, the threats, the physical violence, et cetera, et cetera.
So the streak continues. So you mentioned Vice President Harris. And so I wanted to pick your brain, even though your book talks about the challenges and the solutions to try to get more Black women in positions of leadership at academic institutions. We have a really, really interesting dynamic happening within the next 80 something days where a Black woman, and if you leave it up to other folks, don't forget she's Asian too, a woman of color has a chance to be the president of the United States, a woman, period. So you have this chapter in the book called Breaking Through the Glass Ceiling While Staying Off the Glass Cliff. Apply that chapter to what Vice President Harris is going through.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Like, whenever an organization gets in trouble, they need to show that they're doing something innovative, exciting, different. We're going in a new direction. And so hiring a woman, period, hiring a Black woman in particular, it's like, okay, we are, giving it our all, we're giving our best. So we have Joe Biden who steps down and who comes in as, the heir apparent. It's Kamala Harris, because she's going to save us all. The challenge is, if she does not save us all, the blame will go to her for being in that position. We should have known that she couldn't do X, Y, and Z, that she really is a whatever people want to negatively associate with her name. And actually, we actually needed a really strong white guy. Yeah, her VP should have been on the first on the ticket, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is a challenge to be able to shatter the glass ceiling, or, in Black women's cases, the concrete ceiling, but then also be able to demonstrate small wins early on so that you're not pushed off the glass cliff. And those small wins are going to be things that are going to be demonstrable to the public at large. And so I love Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, but 8 years we were in the presidency. Black leaders historically have had to deal with the constraints of their respective offices. And so some of the first chits are not going to come out to Black and brown women. It's just not, because she's going to have to show that she is of the people, of the entire people, of the most disaffected, or I would say loudly disaffected people. And while I don't like the idea of having to wait in line, it does feel very back of the bus-ish. And so I do get Ta-Nehisi's sentiments in that respect. I think it is that first step towards making real change. History has a way of ebbing and flowing. And if we think about Republicanism back in Booker T. Washington's times, how conservative and reactionary things were. But that's followed by a progressive push. And so I think that the pendulum has, swung as reactionary as it possibly can. And we need to get that momentum going in the other direction, just so that we can get to something that's even, that everybody can live with. Because in this space, I think we're all having literal and figurative challenges with breathing in this environment.
Yeah, that's a heavy statement right there about breathing, because this podcast I do is therapy, right? Because of what's been going on. So I definitely relate to that last statement. So let's close it out with this. Regardless if it is a college campus, a private business, or government, why is diversity and inclusion important to leadership, and why should it be prioritized?
Years ago, I wanted the ad campaign to come up with an infographic, some set of commercials with dollar signs on top of people's heads, and they're sitting in classrooms. And so it's a white male in a room with nothing but other white people with $1 sign, like the $1 sign. But then when it's in a diverse classroom, there's multiple dollar signs. Because actually, in terms of our global output, we know you make more money when you have more voices on the table, and it happens because it enables us to get away from groupthink. And so while we shouldn't, there is a moral issue here, and I don't want to get that lost in the sauce, but it is in our enlightened self-interest. So to make it personal, like what's in it for me, it's in our enlightened self-interest to be more creative by having more voices in table to get to solutions that are going to be more stable, more net positive. And when I say net positive, that's in terms of our social relations, how we interact. But then economically, what our bottom line is, if that's, how we're going to pose ourselves in this neoliberal society, then yeah, you're inhibiting our bottom line when we don't allow for everyone's talent to develop. When we push forward mediocre people while more talented people sit on the sidelines, we undercut ourselves.
Yeah, and I've expressed that on the show as well as others. So it's good to hear that take. It's just the bottom line. This is a capitalistic society, and that we want to always talk about in an egalitarian term that it's like it's the right thing to do to give everybody equity, to include everybody, to have a workplace or an environment where everybody's represented. But this is a capitalistic society. And what I remind people is that the underlying movement toward progress in the United States is based on money. When people made the math equation that the LGBTQ community was the wealthiest block of people in the United States, things started happening. When people realized that it's like, hey, look at Memphis, look at Nashville, look at Atlanta. If black folks are allowed to spend their money and be in the same environment as, everybody else, we make more money. And so that's why public accommodations and the civil rights stuff started happening. It's capitalism is intrinsic in that. So, I get exactly what you're saying, because I've been trying to say the same thing. Is that necessarily, like you say, the moral thing? Not really, but the reality is that in this society, if capitalism is on your side, take advantage of it. And it just boggles my mind that these people are making, in the business of making money, and they want to throw diversity and all that stuff aside. Look, we could talk for a long time. I see that now.
Well, you should invite me back. I have another book coming out next year.
Oh, look, that's a standard rule here. Once you've been on the show, you have an open invitation. So yeah, we definitely going to get you back on, maybe even before the book comes out, because just to have the conversations and to kind of get people in thinking in the right direction, and the work that you and your now fellow doctors put together, is pretty intensive, and it's something, and that's something universal with UWP, which is why I was so glad that Dr. Sakai, I keep giving her flowers every chance I can, because I approached her and said, look, you got all these authors. I've got a podcast. Let's work together. And so I greatly appreciate her, because it's giving me the opportunity to network with people like you and others. So yes, ma'am. Anytime you want to come on, you're more than welcome.
Thank you.
And speaking about the book, how can people get the book? How can people reach out to you to get you to speak on their podcast, or, give lectures, or the whole 9 yards?
So the book is available on Amazon. Also, you can go to UWP Books, and it's available for sale there. In terms of reaching out to me, probably the best way to reach out to me is in LinkedIn. But then I can also be found at my university, Chambers C at ecu.edu.
All right. Well, Dr. Crystal Chambers, even though you try to put me in the trick bag about the age question, I greatly appreciate you coming on. And I thank you for what you're doing. I thank you for being a role model and a teacher, and cultivating more people into the profession. And I wish you much success on the book, continued, even though it's been out for a while, but more money doesn't, we already established more money doesn't hurt, right? But thank you again for taking the time and coming on the podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate that as well.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and associate director of the Liberal Arts Honors Program at the University of Texas at Austin. His new book, The Danger Imperative: Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, shows how policing's preoccupation with danger shapes police culture, and violence in the United States. Sierra-Arévalo's research is published in leading journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Criminology, Law and Society Review, and the Annual Review of Law and Social Science. His writing and research are widely featured in media, including the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Times Higher Education, Slate, GQ, and NPR. He received his PhD in sociology from Yale University and his BA in sociology and psychology for the University of Texas at Austin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege and honor to have as a guest on this podcast, Michael Sierra-Arévalo. All right, Professor Michael Sierra-Arévalo. I'm sorry. Did I say it right?
No, it's Arévalo.
Arévalo. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. All right, I think I got it now. How you doing, sir? You doing good?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me on the show, Eric.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time out to do this. You've got this new book out called The Danger Imperative, so we want to get into that. Because it's a topic that's kind of near and dear to me because I've had a law enforcement background, and I appreciate you and the research that you put into this work. What I like to do at the beginning of the interview is throw a quote at the guest, kind of an icebreaker. So this is your quote: "Racial hierarchy, inequality, and violence are among the oldest American stories." What does that quote mean to you?
That quote was an attempt on my part to summarize a inconvenient and often hidden truth about the origins and current structure of the United States. So people, I think, who in many cases are well-meaning, want to believe that we live in a quote unquote post-racial society. Barack Obama was in the White House and now racism is over. I think that particularly for people of color, for a lot of immigrants, they know better. But some people want to believe that just because we had the Civil Rights Act and just because Martin Luther King changed the world, that suddenly the problem of white supremacy or the problem of racial hierarchy and the inequality that is perpetuated by those broader structures is gone. And it's simply not the case. And if we want to understand today, we need to understand those stories, the roots of what we are as a country.
So, as a sociologist, what motivated you to write this book?
So I was a graduate student in 2012 when I started at Yale. And at first I was studying group violence, so street violence. And I was interested in interventions to reduce street violence that did not rely exclusively on police. And so it's a program called Focus Deterrence. It's been tried in many cities across the US, and it's sort of a collaboration between local community leaders, business owners, church leaders, the principal of the adult high school, social service providers, and then there is also an enforcement component on the back end. So it's not an exclusively law enforcement intervention. And that was the work that I was involved in. I was interested in violence and how to address that violence. And it's in the course of that work that I met police officers in a non-enforcement context for the first time. And when I met them, I was struck how they were simultaneously very mundane. They reminded me a lot of my conservative friends' dads from Texas, where I grew up. They at the one hand, we're talking about violence and murder and shootings as if it's what they dealt with every day. And that's why they were in the room, because they were officers that had a particular expertise on these issues. And then in the next sentence, they would talk about their days off, or they would talk about their kids, or they talk about the boat they wanted to get. And that was an odd tension for me. I'd never met people that sort of lived in this world where violence was a taken for granted given thing, and also they seemed very normal, or at least not all that remarkable as people. But I wasn't really interested in policing as a topic of study yet until Michael Brown was killed in 2014 in Ferguson. And as part of a whole generation of scholars and people that are running for office and people that decided to go to school, my lens on the world was shifted towards the criminal legal system and particularly towards policing. And so I set out at that time to try to better understand how Michael Brown, and it, since then the list of names is very long and growing only longer, how that list of names and how these problems are perpetuated across time, why we've had commissions at the local, state, and federal level for 100 years pointing to the problem of brutality and police violence, and why we essentially continue to have these same commissions making the same recommendations. I wanted to understand the how and why of police violence.
So define what exactly is the danger imperative.
The danger imperative is a term that I came up with to describe a particular cultural frame that exists within policing. Now, cultural frames, fancy sociology speak. What it refers to really is a lens or a filter. So we all have lenses and filters. If you are a student at a school, you have a filter or a lens that you have on when you're in that space, and you pay attention to certain things and you ignore other things, and you give meaning to things that you're perceiving in the world based on your context. And that's not the same lens that you put on when you, say, are playing for a sports team, or if you're a doctor or a lawyer. You have different lenses that you wear in the course of your work or in the course of your life. Policing is no different. There's a particular lens that officers have on when they view the world in the context of their work. So the danger imperative is this lens within policing that I argue is centered on the preoccupation with violence and the need to ensure officer safety at all times. So this lens is why, for the average citizen, somebody standing on the corner in the winter with their hands in their pockets, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do because it's cold and they're just standing on the corner. Maybe they're waiting for an Uber, maybe they're just waiting for a friend, or they're just standing. But a police officer, when they view those things through this particular lens, they are actually taught and expected to understand that, yeah, that person might be waiting for an Uber or just standing, but they might also have their hands on a gun in their pocket. They might also be waiting to hurt me as a police officer. And that is the difference. That is the lens that police are taught to and expected to have on whenever they interact with other people. And it's part of what I wanted to explain to people in the context of the book, that this is something that's expected and normal for police, that many citizens simply do not understand.
So your book is structured to explain like the four phases of institutionalizing this danger imperative. Quickly explain those phases.
All right, I'm gonna try and go through the book real quickly. So chapter one. So chapter one is called Survival School, and this is phase one. This is your first and formal introduction to what the danger imperative is. And so for many people, they might have some sense of what policing is because they watch Cops, or they saw End of Watch, or they saw movies. And the academy is the place where you have a lot of that stripped away. And you are told this is not the movies. This is an incredibly dangerous job. And if you don't take the threat of violence seriously, you're going to potentially wind up dead, or you're going to get your partner killed, or you're going to get an innocent person killed. And so the academy is this short, very intense introduction and socialization into the danger imperative. You learn how to fight. You are taught that these are the skills that will keep you alive. You are shown videos of officers being killed in the line of duty. You go through these real life simulation exercises where if you don't see the simulation gun that's stuck in the cushions of the car, or it's put in the glove compartment, then that officer who's playing the driver will get out and murder you. All of this in the academy is focused on building the foundation of the danger imperative. But then chapter two, this is a chapter, it's called Ghosts of the Fallen. This is about the sort of taken for granted things that exist once you leave the police academy. This is about all the commemorations of officers that are killed in the line of duty, whether it was 100 years ago or 10 years ago or even last year. All these names, these faces, they're on the walls of the police department. Sometimes actual photographs, sometimes it's just names and their end of watch date. Sometimes it's a black granite wall, sometimes it's a bronze statue. But these are just the most public commemorations. There are also these commemorations that exist behind the scenes that you can't see unless you get inside the police department. It is SWAT team helmets with officers' names spray painted on them from when they were killed in a raid. It's firearms that are posted up on the wall that you can't see from the outside, but are weapons that were seized on the street to remind you of the weapons that can take your life. It's tattoos, it's t-shirts, sweatshirts, commemoration runs. All of this is built around death and commemoration of officers. And all of that serves as concrete and very powerful evidence that not only was policing dangerous, it remains dangerous and will continue to be dangerous, no matter where you happen to be a police officer. Then chapter three is called The Threat Network. This is about the daily procedures that no one really thinks a whole lot about, but which are daily reminders of the violence that exists at home in your local department and in other places. And this is something that's supported by a vast network of intelligence. This is something that exists at the local, state, county, and federal level. This is something that was supercharged by the war on terror. And initially, this fusion network, the fusion centers that were created by DHS after 9/11, those were for terrorism-related information. But it turns out that in the scope of things, there's not all that much terrorism. But these centers exist. So it's more, you have the tool, so what are you going to transmit to this network? And it becomes daily information about any number of threats to officer safety that may be local, but it also could be something that, if you're on the West Coast, it'll be an example of a shotgun hidden inside of a water gun in Florida. That will get transmitted through that network, and that's something that reifies the sense that a threat to an officer anywhere is a threat to officers everywhere. Then the final chapter is called Going Home at Night. And this is about how all the stuff that I talk about, chapters 1 through 3, maybe it's not all that important. Maybe it's all fine. What about behavior? And this is how I articulate that while we concentrate on shootings, and we should care about shootings, that is the rarest kind of violence that officers use in the line of duty. Much more common is grabbing somebody, pushing somebody, handcuffing somebody, tackling somebody. It's these daily instances of violence, if not deadly violence. And it's explaining how officers, just by doing their job, and to be very clear, most of it, the vast majority is legal. The vast majority results in no broken bones. It results in nobody going to prison. It's the daily practice of violence and being prepared for violence and using violence in the name of officer safety that actively recreates the frame of the danger imperative.
Yeah,
How'd I do? That was my attempt at a full book.
And that was an excellent summary. And the reason why it hit me so is because I remember one of my instructors, stressing how he would look at any person, whether it was a young man or a 90-year-old woman, and he said, before I really engage with anybody, always figure out how I'm going to take them out, right? He said, I do a full assessment at what may be their weakness, whatever, and then that's always in the back of his mind. That's something that's instilled. And like you said, a lot of the scenarios that we call the survivor's week, right? And they would throw us at any kind of scenario. It could be we get a mental health call, it could be a domestic call, whatever it is. And it always ends up as like, if we make a mistake, bang, we're gone, right? And even the films we would watch, it was like, it wouldn't even be related to shooting. It would be our hazardous waste training, how to identify symbols. And we saw a film where an officer responded and he ran into this cloud, and like 3 seconds later, he was down on the ground. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it's like as reading that and even listening to you just then, it just reminded me of that intensity that they put in on the extremes to get your mind set on scenarios and to always be aware of a constant threat.
Mhm.
Talk to the listeners about the cycle of violence to crisis to piecemeal reform.
Mhm. So, for listeners, I am currently 34 years old. I was born in 1990, and I I grew up in a neighborhood that did not have police sirens in it. I grew up in a neighborhood that was very safe, and I was very insulated from the reality of what many people, particularly in poor minority communities, grow up with, right? Sirens all the time. They see people getting stopped on the streets. They get their friends locked up. Their friends have had bad run-ins with the police. I didn't grow up in that environment. And so I knew broadly about things like Rodney King. I knew about some key instances of things like King and then later Amadou Diallo in New York. I knew about these things sort of cursorily. Ferguson was the first time that what I was reading about as a student, as a graduate student, sort of came to life in a massive national way. And it was very clear to me, even in that moment, though I was not an expert by any means at the time about policing or police violence, that this was not just a passing sort of story. This was something that made international news. Um, and so I began to read. I began to read about this history. And that's when I, for the first time, really saw, oh, there's a pattern where a story, there's an incident of violence, um, usually against a black person, usually a black man. It makes news. There is outrage. There are news stories. Politicians are pressured to act. And so then we get a commission of some kind. And, lo and behold, the pattern played out. We had Michael Brown, who was killed. And also, it happened to be a moment where Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, it all happened like in like a couple of months. And this is, again, I'm forming my ideas of what I want to study and what the problems are that I want to focus on. And then we get President Obama's 21st Century Task Force. And I read the report that comes out, and I can't help but feel like I think I've read this before in some way. And I go and find commissions from the 1970s, and lo and behold, they weren't recommending body cameras, which was big in the 21st century one because of technology, but they were recommending community policing, and they were recommending similar reforms. And a lot of those things happened. I think that body cameras, we now know they're not the silver bullet, no pun intended, that we expected them to be or wanted them to be. There was more discussion of things like procedural justice. And I think that on balance, those are good things. But it's very clear, I think, that particularly if you live in places that are hyper policed, it's very clear to people that study this, or it should be, in my opinion, that these are piecemeal steps. They are steps that are taken to assuage political outrage. They're taken for the sake of political expediency. Body cameras are expensive, but they're a lot cheaper than completely overhauling a criminal legal system or addressing poverty. Uh, and then a couple of years went by, and then George Floyd was murdered, and the cycle played out again. And that's what I'm referring to. So I only have memory, and I can only see the past 10 years or so of this. But if you've been around a minute, I think it's very obvious if you've been paying attention that this is something that happens pretty frequently, and we continue to have very similar conversations year after year, decade after decade.
Yeah. So why do you think community policing is a failed concept?
Mm. So, uh, a failed concept, I think, might be too strong.
Okay.
I think that it is a concept which is everything and it is nothing. And so, because it's that, it is impossible for it to succeed. It's also impossible for it to fail. And so, you're someone with law enforcement experience. If I were to ask 100 officers what they think community policing is, I suspect I'll get 300 different answers. And one person will say it's community walking beats. One person will say bike patrols. One person will say community meetings. Somebody will say coffee with a cop. Somebody will say there's no such thing as community policing because community policing is just good policing, and on and on and on and on and on. And so originally, as it was conceived, community policing was not a set of things that you do. It was more of a philosophy. It was an idea that the community, broadly defined, should have some say in what problems the police department addresses. And in order to make that function, then we saw some very basic techniques implemented, things like community meetings. That would be a mechanism for the community to tell departments what they care about and what they want something to be done about. And then from there, community policing, this is in part because the COPS office was formed in the 90s and a bunch of money was put available for departments to apply for community policing grants. And so, frankly, like if you're writing the grant, you write whatever you need to write to get a couple $1 million to pad the budget, to pay for overtime, and to have community policing in your department, whatever that means. And so I don't say that community policing has failed, in part because we have very little evidence that it's ever been consistently applied. To that point, though, myself and my colleagues Kyle Payton and David Rand, we did an experiment in New Haven a couple of years ago where we tried to get at the smallest measurable piece of community policing, sort of the basis of the idea, which is that if you have a positive non-enforcement interaction with a police officer, you can improve that relationship. You can enhance trust. That's essentially the basic building block. And we randomize these community door knocks where officers just knock on the door, introduce themselves, 5-minute conversation. I'm Officer Sierra-Arévalo. I'm the community policing officer in this area. I'm here because I'm interested in keeping our community safe. If there are any issues that you want me to know about, you can tell me now. Here's my card. That's how we designed the experiment. And we found that that simple couple of minutes can significantly improve people's perceptions of the police. They feel they are more trustworthy. They feel police are more effective. They feel they're more legitimate. And that effect is something that lasts up to 3 weeks. It's not like something that lasts a couple hours. And it's something that's strongest. The effect is biggest amongst Black residents of New Haven. We suspect in part because their opinions are generally lower. So there's more room to improve. I don't think that that's a resounding win for community policing, but I do think that it suggests that if we were to try and actually implement community policing in a systematic way and actually measure the things that we say we care about, like community perceptions and trust, there might be something there. But people that want to say community policing is going to reduce crime, the evidence for that is at best very, very weak, and not something that I would ever say community policing has been shown to do reliably.
Yeah, and so that's where my political experience kicks in, because whenever you're talking about building community and making communities safer, when a politician like me will say, well, I'm an advocate for community policing, that gets a positive response because people are like, oh, so he's not the law and order kind of politician where he just wants to lock people up. He wants to have a relationship between the community and the police. So, like you said, it's a concept, and it sounds really, really appealing. But when you start getting into the brass tacks of how to actually implement it for your community, like you said, you get those various opinions. That's why I laughed when you said 100 people will give you 300 different responses, because that's a reality that a lot of people don't quite understand.
That's right.
How does? Oh, let me ask you this. You stated that today's officers are armed social workers, yet they are woefully unprepared to address those issues. Talk about that.
So I think that my view of policing is deeply informed by this process of coming to understand what the reality of the work is. And so prior to me beginning this research in 2014, I'd only ever experienced police in the context of enforcement. I got arrested for, like, not even really arrested, I guess cited and released for shoplifting when I was 15. I had a run-in with a state trooper in Texas who was very, very mean I was with my friends who were both Black, and it was not a great stop. Flashlight in the eyes, like "don't look at me" kind of thing, for essentially speeding, that kind of stuff. And then I saw movies. I saw cops, and I saw cop movies. And if you watch the movies, it's heroic gunfights, it's gangbangers and murder and anti-trafficking units. It's the stuff that is interesting to watch. And then I got into a car. And when I say that the reality of the work could not be further from what people's perceptions of the job are, what media, and frankly, what police themselves sort of amplify for the public. You ever seen a recruiting video for a big city department? It's rappelling out of helicopters and it's SWAT team flashbangs. Like they're trying to attract 20-year-old men that play Call of Duty at this point, which I get, it's always been young men, but that's not what the work is. And so when I say that police are essentially armed social workers, that's a reflection of what I saw happening. I never saw an officer, not that it doesn't happen, but I went to 3 cities. I was with them for hundreds and hundreds of hours. Um, I never saw them even get close to a gunfight, thankfully. Instead, I saw them deal day in and day out with the symptoms of inequality. I saw them deal with the symptoms of broken education, of mental illness. I saw them deal far more often with substance abuse and mental health problems and homelessness than I ever saw them deal with violence. Though we went to calls, that much is true. And so what officers really end up doing is taking a gun with them to try to deal with somebody who really just needs a therapist and some medication, or they go to or they go to a house where things are coming apart at the seams and people are physically fighting with each other, but it's not a triple stabbing. It's a low level DV incident, and really what they need is $1,000 a month so they're less stressed about life and they're not fighting about the rent. That's what they really need. And so officers go to these places, and when I say they're poorly trained to deal with these things, because they don't have $1,000 in their pocket. They're not mental health care professionals. They can't actually get these people out of poverty. They can't teach these people coping skills. That's not their job. Officers are trained to, when the situation calls for it, use violence to make people do things. That's why you call the police, because the police can make you do something under color of law. So what I ended up seeing far more often was officers that knew full well that they could not actually fix what they were going to go and try to address. Their job was to shuffle problems around. Their job was to tell somebody, look, you got to get a restraining order. I can't give that to you, but like you go to the court, you get the form, or I can take the report for your stolen whatever. It's unlikely we're ever going to find this person. I saw officers far more often tell people, there's nothing I can do about this, than actually solve problems. And when they did solve problems, it was with a very limited set of very coarse tools. It was tickets, it was arrest, it was force.
Yeah, and that's a reality. And one of the things now is that they offer this training in crisis intervention, but not everybody goes to it, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
mandated. It's just kind of like, oh well, you get another pin on your uniform, or you might get a bump in pay. It all depends on how the department goes, but it's something I think that is more realistic of what an officer deals with,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not mandate. At least not where I was in law enforcement. It's not mandated. It's kind of like a
Mm-hmm.
special privilege to get that. So that's why I wanted you to highlight that. And real quick, I got a couple other questions.
Yeah, of course.
How does otherism define policing in America?
How does otherism?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with otherism. Like
So
just othering others, or
it's like somebody other than me, right? So I'm an officer, and let's just say I'm a white officer, and I have a opinion about people other than me, or even as a black officer, I have people opinion other than me.
mm,
Does that play a lot? I guess the technical term would be implicit bias.
mm,
Does how does that define policing in America based on what you observed?
yeah. So I think that there are two overlapping things that stand out to me within policing in the context of my book, The Danger Imperative. One is what scholars have referred to broadly as a sort of us versus them mentality. And that us versus them is formally an aracial concept, meaning there's no black and white because it's blue and not blue. That's the important distinction there. There's people in uniform, there's people out of uniform. And that allows you to make a whole bunch of assumptions about the world outside and about yourselves as police officers. So the us, of course, police, these are people that understand how things really are. We're in the know. We've been trained to understand that the world outside is very, very dangerous. It's very violent. And so whatever happens within the context of the police department or within policing more broadly, as long as that's for officer safety, that's a good thing. We can justify almost anything as long as we can tie it back to officer safety. If it's for the benefit of officer safety, it is good and it is necessary. Anybody that suggests that it's not is either not one of us or they're to be distrusted. So anyone that raises a red flag about why are we inviting this guy Dave Grossman, who I talk about in the book, the guy, the founder of Killology, says that you have to become the predator to catch the predator. If somebody were to say, like, hold on, wait a minute, like, why are we inviting this guy? I read his book, and he's like, who is this guy, and why are we teaching this? That is liable to raise concerns about whether or not you're really on the team. By extension, or more it's sort on the reverse, it also lets you make assumptions about people out there, the people who are not police officers. And this is not just about citizens. Citizens are assumed to be people that do not understand you. They are assumed to be people that, in some cases, want to physically harm or kill you. But you're also just assumed to be ignorant. Don't ask me questions about my job. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're not a police officer. You're just one of them. You're not one of us. But it also includes not citizens, but also other institutions. The media, for example, is not to be trusted. The media is the enemy of the police. The media is trying to get clicks and sell papers. They never get the story right. They don't like police officers. Politicians get roped into the them. Politicians are not to be trusted. They're here to make political points off of us. They don't support us. So us versus them is this aracial version. Your question about implicit bias is something that certainly exists. It is something that is very hush-hush. Officers, and as I talk about in the book, policing writ large, generally likes to just not mention race. And so you can get really far talking about just threat, weapons, violence, officer safety, and never mention the fact that these things are all racially coded. We have evidence now from several decades about implicit bias showing that Black men are seen inherently as more distrustful, more likely to be violent, more likely to be seen as criminal or liable. We know these biases exist. They're not something that is talked about explicitly, or at least it was not talked about explicitly among the officers that I spent time with. And importantly, this is the last thing I'll say on this is not something that exists strictly among white officers. This is something that exists within policing writ large. Black officers also have implicit biases. And to be clear, implicit bias, I think, is a preferred term. Sometimes they just say racist things, like it's just racist. But these implicit biases, even when someone is not saying overtly racist things, like Black people are more violent, they may not say those things, but implicit biases speak to these underlying assumptions, these underlying cognitive patterns or stereotypes that many people hold about racial groups, even about places that are assumed to be violent, places that are assumed to be dangerous.
So, as a follow up and last question, do you do you think racism is more prevalent in police departments than the society at large, or no?
I think we actually have evidence to suggest that, though it's not a national sample, but we have evidence from smaller scale surveys that racist attitudes are more common within policing than within the general public. Importantly, this is something that is true not only of white officers compared to white non-officers, but of Black officers compared to Black non-officers. So to my earlier point, it's incorrect to make the assumption that racism or implicit bias, whichever I guess preferred term you want to use, is something that's restricted to, the stereotypical shaved head white cop with the Oakleys and the big biceps. It's not. It's not just that. Those attitudes tend to be more extreme, and there are frankly many more white officers in policing than Black officers. But the story of racism and the story of bias is not a bad apples problem. This is not about individual officers. This is about a system. It's about a system, an institution that recreates ways of understanding not only what the problems are, but also what the preferred solutions are for those problems. And very often, in fact, almost exclusively, the problem, the issue of safety and violence is something that police are called upon to address. And the tools to address it are very coarse tools.
So, Professor, how can people get the book? How can people get in touch with you to get you to talk about it or whatever the case may be?
So my book, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, is available anywhere books are sold, but also on Amazon. If you do pop by on Amazon, please leave a review. And if you want to get in contact with me, you can visit www.dangerimperative.com. You can shoot me a message, and I'd be happy to get in touch about the book or about anything else.
Well, Michael Sierra-Arévalo, I greatly appreciate you doing this kind of work and putting it in a book form. I think it's a must read for people to have a better understanding of what, as it ties in. We just had another officer indicted uh, for killing a black woman, Takia Young, I believe her name is, in
Hmm.
Ohio. A pregnant black woman got shot in a supermarket.
Oh,
Um,
I saw that the car chase or the that
the
yeah in
the
the
car
car, right?
bumping. It wasn't even a
That's
chase.
right.
She
Yeah, it wasn't
bumped
a
the
chase.
car. So it's a relevant topic, and I think that you shed some light on it that you kind of opened a veil that a lot of people were not aware of. So I thank you for that, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
No, I appreciate that, Eric, and I am sad to say that I fear that the topic of the book will continue to be relevant for the foreseeable future. But hopefully, it helps people better understand that these are not accidents. This is not bad apples. This is the system working as it was designed to work. It's a system that is designed to ensure officer safety at all times and at all costs, even at the expense of the safety and well-being of those which officers are supposed to be protecting and serving.
All right, and with that, y'all, we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I want to thank uh, my college professors slash authors, Dr. Crystal Chambers and Dr. Michael Sierra Arevalo, for coming on and discussing those topics. I think that uh, Dr. Chambers' perspective on what's happening with Vice President Harris is very, very spot on. And of course, with Dr. Sierra Arevalo's book, The Danger Imperative, what we are dealing um, with the police. And it's a very, very interesting perspective, and one that I really could relate to. And to have somebody describe the experience I went through as an outsider was is a very, very, very good read. And again, I encourage y'all to get their books, especially going back to Dr. Chambers. I want to again shout out UWP, Universal Right Publications, Dr. A.O. Sakai, and we mentioned it a lot in the interview, but really want to encourage y'all to utilize, go to that website and check out the books that are out there. This is a black publishing company, and want to really show support for that, and along with any authors, period. But I really want to stress that one. The other thing I want to say before I get off is that by the time you hear this, I will be in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, and we, and I say we now. I do that a lot. I don't know. It's, I guess, me, myself, and I most of the time, but it's actually going to be we, because as it's gotten closer to the convention, I've had a lot of outreach from fellow podcasters and social media influencers to help put our perspective on this convention. And I'm a big ram in the bush person. I believe if there are talented people within your circle, you utilize them, and share them with others. And I'm also a big collaborator. I like working with other like-minded people to do something positive. And so I want y'all to pay attention to Patreon this week, because I will be doing my best to get interviews, and I do have a regular guest that is scheduled for the traditional Monday podcast, but I'm going to be doing, it's going to be newsmakers in the political field all over the place. So I don't, if I get 5 minutes, or if I can get a whole sit down for like 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to do the best I can. And I guess the most distinctive interview, I'll save that for the traditional Monday podcast along with the other guests. If not, then just follow on Patreon, because I'll be talking to different people throughout the week, and just getting their quick assessments about the fate of the Democrats going into the final days of the election. Also, speaking about supporting Black endeavors, a lot of you may be on or heard of Clubhouse. Well, there's a Black version of that called Chatter Social. And, I kind of gotten in on the ground floor of that, and it is rapidly expanding as far as users. And I want to take advantage of that and highlight that app. And so we're going to do live from the convention, basically from 8 o'clock Eastern time to 11 o'clock Eastern time, which will be 7 to 10 local time in Chicago, to highlight some, the keynote speakers, and to get reactions from people at the conventions and all that. So there's a collaboration working to make that as awesome as it can be, and come from a perspective, not from the typical talking heads that you see on the network news. And you will get uninterrupted speeches that you wouldn't get. It's like the headliner gets the full attention on the national news, like when President Biden or Vice President Harris or Governor Walz will speak. But there are people that'll be speaking before them, and we're not going to be covering the whole thing, because it starts like at 5:30 Central Time with speeches and all that stuff. So we won't get some of those people, but we'll get the ones that were set for prime time, and we won't necessarily cut them off. You'll get to hear those whole speeches, and if everything goes right, if you go to Chatter, you'll be able to see it uncut and in real time. So that's what we're working on. Again, trying to make this podcast literally the podcast of our time, the podcast that will highlight what's going on in the political world from a African American perspective, somebody that's been an elected official, to really, really touch on not just issues in a broad sense, but just really kind of go deep, and again to highlight the people who are working behind the scenes to make society better. Not necessarily the elected officials, but everyday citizens using their talents to make society better as a whole, especially American society. So again, I want to thank y'all for the support. Even though we didn't raise the money that we wanted, God is good and everything's taken care of. And I'll be safe and secure while I'm in Chicago. Plus, I have family there still. So, so the way it's working out, I'll have some time, family time with them, maybe even some sightseeing time just to see some stuff I hadn't seen before. So if you follow me on the socials, you'll probably see some pictures or whatever. And then, we'll go to work. And, but everything is going to continue as normal as far as the regular podcast. It should be a good time. It's definitely going to be a historic time for sure. So again, I just thank y'all for supporting me in this endeavor. And until next time.